I used to think the worst pain came from strangers, people who drift into your life and disappear just as easily. I was wrong. The deepest cuts come from the people who are supposed to protect you. The ones who share your home. The ones who claim they care. For years, I tried to ignore the tension in our house, brushing off the comments, pretending the whispers didn't sting. I kept my head down, worked hard, and told myself things would eventually get better. But they didn't. They only sharpened. And the moment my stepdad looked at me with that cold, bitter stare and called me useless, something inside me cracked open. Not with sadness. Not with fear. But with clarity. Because I knew something about him. Something buried so deep in our family shadows that he thought it would never see daylight. Something he prayed no one would ever uncover. And in that moment, standing there with his insult echoing in my mind, I realized I wasn't powerless. I wasn't small. I held the one thing he feared most. I just had to decide how far I was willing to go. Before everything fell apart, before his perfect little facade shattered, there was one choice that changed everything. Do you want to know what pushed me to expose the secret that destroyed his life? Before everything spiraled into the chaos that would eventually consume my home, my life was painfully ordinary in a way that almost feels comforting when you look back on it. I was 24, juggling a modest administrative job at a small local firm while saving every extra dollar I could. My days were predictable. Morning coffee, the quiet walk to the bus stop, the hum of the office photocopier, evenings spent catching up on tasks or escaping into books that made my life feel bigger than it was. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just a steady rhythm that felt safe. I lived with my mom and stepdad, partly out of necessity and partly because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone with him. She always insisted she was fine, that things were better than before, that his temper was just stress, but I'd grown used to reading the hesitation in her smile. Still, we managed. We laughed when we could, cooked dinner together most nights, and found small comfort in the routines we built. I held on to those moments like they were proof that our lives weren't as fragile as they felt. My stepdad, Mark, rarely participated in those moments. He lingered on the edges of the house the same way a storm cloud clings to the horizon, never fully unleashing itself, but never letting you forget it's there. He'd been unemployed for months, though he called it being between opportunities, as if that phrasing alone could disguise the truth. He spent his days brooding in the living room, flipping through channels, scrolling endlessly on his phone, or pacing with the restlessness of someone who resented the world for not recognizing his supposed potential. At first, I told myself his bitterness wasn't directed at me, that I was just imagining the sharpness in his tone or the judgment in his eyes. But little by little, the tension in the house grew too thick to ignore. Every time I came home from work, I braced myself for what version of him I'd encounter, silent and simmering, or talkative, but only in ways that made me feel smaller. Still, I pushed forward. I tried to stay focused on my own life, my job, my goals, the quiet ambitions I nurtured in the privacy of my journal. I want to move out someday, get my own place, maybe go back to school. Those dreams felt like little lanterns in the darkness, guiding me forward. But the more strained the atmosphere at home became, the more those lanterns flickered. There were signs, of course. Small ones that didn't make sense until later. The way he'd hover near my bedroom door sometimes, as if listening. The way he'd pepper my mom with questions about my schedule or habits. The late-night phone calls he tried to hide, ending abruptly the moment I entered the room. I brushed it all off as paranoia, telling myself I was overreacting. After all, life has taught me to normalize discomfort, to smooth over the rough edges, to keep the peace even when it costs me pieces of myself. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Something in him. And something in me. The last few months before everything unraveled were the hardest to explain, because nothing explosive happened. Nothing obvious or dramatic. It was more like a slow tightening. A quiet building of pressure. The kind of change you only recognize in hindsight when you realize how many times you ignored your own instincts because you didn't want to believe what they were telling you. I felt it every morning before I left for work, in the way he watched me with a mixture of disdain and something I couldn't identify at the time. I felt it in the silence that followed me down the hallway, the silence that seemed to pulse with unspoken contempt. And I felt it in myself, the growing unease, the sense that something was terribly off but still hidden just out of reach. If I had known what was coming, what secret he was so desperate to keep buried, I might have been more afraid. Or maybe I would have acted sooner. But back then, I was still trying to make life feel normal. Still hoping the tension would settle on its own. I didn't know it yet, but the moment he called me useless, that thin layer of normalcy would finally crack, revealing everything underneath. The truth I wasn't supposed to find, the secret he never thought I'd uncover, and the path I was about to take that would change all of our lives forever. The shift began the morning after he called me useless, an insult that seemed to echo long after the moment passed, lingering in the corners of every room. I woke up with a pressure in my chest, something between humiliation and anger, something I couldn't shake. It wasn't the first cruel thing he'd ever said to me, but it was the first time it felt intentional, calculated, like he wanted to break something inside me. And for the first time, I felt something inside me push back. I went about my day with a new kind of awareness, watching him the way someone watches a crack form in a wall, knowing it would spread, knowing it would eventually reveal everything holding the structure together. He moved through the house with an air of entitlement, like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't shattered the fragile piece we'd built. My mom tried to pretend things were normal, but I saw the way her shoulders tightened whenever he entered the room, the way she avoided looking at me for too long, as if she worried I'd say something that would rip open the tension completely. The first real fracture came a few days later. I started noticing patterns, small inconsistencies in his behavior that didn't align with the image he tried to project. He'd been unemployed for months, yet somehow he always managed to pay for things my mom claimed they couldn't afford. New electronics, new clothes, frequent packages delivered quietly to the porch. Expensive-looking tools he insisted were investments for jobs that never materialized. And then there were the nights he disappeared. He'd tell my mom he was out looking for work, but he'd come home smelling like old cigarettes, like places he shouldn't have been. I pretended not to notice, but internally, a suspicion began to form, thin at first, but pulling tighter each day. The turning point came one evening when I returned home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, unnaturally so, and I felt it the second I stepped inside, a tension so thick it felt like walking into a vacuum. My mom wasn't home yet. Mark was nowhere to be seen. I headed to my room with the intention of showering and winding down, but as I passed the living room, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. I followed the sound to the small office space my mom used for occasional remote work. The door was partially open, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something felt off. Something told me to look. When I pushed the door open, I froze. Mark was sitting at my mom's desk, hunched over her old laptop. His shoulders stiffened when he heard the door, and he slammed the screen shut so quickly it rattled. He muttered something under his breath and shouldered past me, leaving the room without a backward glance. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't have to. The guilt was written in the tension of his movements. When he left the house minutes later, slamming the door behind him, I waited for the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway, and then I went straight to the laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew something was there, some truth buried beneath all his excuses and bitterness. When I opened the laptop, a window popped up immediately, like it had never been properly closed. A list of emails. Dozens of them. Some flagged. Some hidden deep within folders my mom never used. My heart began to pound. I scrolled. And then I saw it. Messages sent from anonymous accounts, replies written in rushed, secretive language, files attached with titles that made my stomach twist. There were spreadsheets, long lists of transactions, names, dates, all tied to what looked like a growing pattern of illegal activity. Stolen information, fraudulent accounts, payments routed through multiple identities. Some even had signatures that looked strikingly similar to my mom's handwriting, except I knew she would never be part of anything like this. I clicked on one of the earliest emails, and that's when I saw it, an application submitted in my name. It used my information, my birth date, my address. But the signature wasn't mine. It was his. At that moment, a cold wave washed over me. He wasn't just bitter. He wasn't just unemployed. He was using us.
He was using me.
And the worst part? The application was for a credit line I had never opened. The balance was nearly maxed out. My name was tied to it all. My hands shook as I kept digging. Every file revealed another layer of betrayal. He'd been stealing from my mom. He'd been forging her signature. He'd been opening accounts under false names. He'd been funneling money into places the emails didn't fully explain. It wasn't just desperation or poor decision-making. It was calculated.
Hidden. Planned.
And then I saw the final blow, an email thread between Mark and someone identified only as GD. They discussed steps for securing the girl's info, referencing me, as if I were a resource, a tool, something to exploit. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. The realization hit me with a force that made me physically sway. He had been preparing to ruin me completely. That's when fear turned into something else, a sharp, burning resolve. I knew I couldn't confront him yet. Not without proof he couldn't spin. Not without a plan that would stop him from destroying both me and my mom. So I started collecting everything I could. Every file, every email, every document that showed what he'd been doing. I created backups, stored them in places he could never reach. I began tracing the patterns in the transactions, noticing the connections between names, accounts, and his unexplained purchases. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became. He had a web of schemes, small enough to stay under the radar, but tangled enough to ruin anyone caught in them. My name was already in the center. Each discovery felt like a punch to the gut. But each one also fueled my determination. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was preparing to bring down a man who had been quietly destroying our lives from within. Late at night, while the house slept, I mapped out every step. I watched him closely during the day, observing how careless he became when he thought no one suspected him. I tracked his patterns when he left the house, when he checked the mail, when he made those suspicious phone calls. Every detail mattered. Every piece of information was another thread I could pull until his entire web collapsed around him. I didn't cry. Not anymore. The hurt had transformed into something steadier, colder, more focused. And just when I thought I had uncovered it all, I stumbled onto something that made everything else seem small. A hidden folder on the laptop, buried beneath layers of encrypted files. A folder he had named innocuously, Taxes_2017. But when I finally opened it, I found something different. Photos.
Documents.
Bank forms tied to people who weren't my mom or me. Evidence of identities he had stolen. People he had targeted long before he ever entered our lives. My breath caught. He was far worse than I ever imagined. He wasn't just a lazy, bitter man. He was a predator. And we were his newest victims. The truth wrapped itself around me, heavy and suffocating, yet clarifying all at once. I knew what I had to do, but exposing someone like him wasn't simple. One wrong move, and he'd wipe everything clean, or worse, turn his schemes against me in ways I couldn't recover from. So I planned. I waited. I watched. And then, I found the one piece of evidence he wouldn't be able to escape. The proof that would unravel every lie he ever told. The proof that would destroy him. But to use it, I'd have to take a risk that could cost everything. And I wasn't sure, even then, whether I'd make it out unscathed. The night everything came together felt unreal, too quiet, too still, as if the house itself sensed what was about to unfold. For weeks, I had been gathering every piece of evidence, every file, every detail that tied Mark to the tangled web of fraud he'd built. I'd organized it all, cross-checked it, backed it up on multiple drives. All that remained was exposing him in a way he couldn't deny or destroy. A way that would protect me, protect my mom, and ensure there was no way out for him. The moment came on a Thursday evening, when the sky outside had turned a bruised purple and the air felt heavier than usual. My mom was working late, unaware of the truth that was about to rip through our home. Mark had spent most of the day pacing the living room, irritated about something he wouldn't explain. His mood made the house feel smaller, like the walls were inching inward. I waited patiently in my room, listening to his footsteps, timing everything down to the second. At 7:18 p.m., he stepped outside to check the mail, something he did obsessively, as though every envelope held a secret he needed to intercept before anyone else could see it. That was when I left my room. My hands were steady. My heartbeat wasn't. But the resolve I'd built over the past weeks clung to me like armor. I walked into the living room, set my laptop on the coffee table, and connected it to the old TV mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life just as the front door creaked open again. He froze in the doorway when he saw me standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the air felt electric, humming with everything that had been building beneath the surface. I could feel his suspicion sharpen. He always made sense when he was losing control. Without a word, I pressed a key. The first set of documents appeared on the screen: transaction logs, spreadsheets, the earliest emails. His emails. I didn't need dialogue. I didn't need an accusation. The truth was shining on the screen in front of him, bright and damning, impossible to twist or ignore. He stepped closer, slowly, like someone approaching a precipice. His eyes darted across the screen, flicking through the evidence that traced every one of his lies, and for the first time, I saw something break in his expression. No shame. No regret. Fear. Raw, unmistakable fear. He lunged toward the laptop, but I had already anticipated the move. Another key press, and the TV displayed a new screen, a video recording I'd saved to the drive and backed up a dozen times. Footage from the security camera at the mailbox showing him pocketing letters addressed to me. Another clip showing him forging my mom's signature on a form she never saw. Each act is exposed in brutal clarity. His breath hitched. His hands curled into fists. But he didn't move again. I could feel the shift happening inside me. A strange calm, the kind that comes when you stop being afraid and start taking back what was taken from you. I stepped aside and let the final blow appear. The folder of stolen identities. The documents connecting him to accounts under false names. The email chain plotting how to secure the girl's info. Me, as leverage for a scheme he hadn't completed yet. Each file flashed across the screen like a diagnosis.
Cold. Precise.
Terminal. He stared at me then, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that I held more power than he had ever imagined. His voice cracked, not with apology but with the horror of realizing he had been beaten at his own game. I didn't need to speak. I simply turned the screen toward him, revealing the final piece. A digital report addressed to federal investigators. One I had already submitted an hour earlier. The room seemed to tilt around him as he processed it. I could see the exact second he realized it was over. Truly over. The mask he had hidden behind for years shattered, leaving behind something hollow and cornered. He tried to speak, but the sound barely formed. His hands trembled. His face was drained of color. The gravity of what was coming settled over him like a weight he couldn't shake. And then the knock on the door. Firm. Measured. I didn't move. I didn't flinch.
He did.
For a moment, he looked at me with a desperation that might have resembled pleading, if I didn't know the monster behind it. It wasn't remorse. It was a survival instinct. Another knock. This one is louder. He took a step back toward the hallway, as if running could save him. But it was too late. The truth was already out. The report had already been filed. The evidence had already been reviewed. And the authorities were already here. The door opened before he could reach the hallway. What happened next was a blur of movement. Voices at the door, heavy footsteps crossing the threshold, officers stepping forward with purpose. I watched it all from where I stood, feeling strangely detached, as though my body had finally drifted free from the fear that had held it for so long. Mark's protests were frantic, incoherent. He reached toward me, maybe to blame me, maybe to beg, maybe to threaten, but the officers cut him off. They restrained him, read him his rights, and guided him toward the door. His eyes stayed locked on mine until the moment he stepped outside. For a second, I wondered what he saw. Strength? Betrayal? Justice? Maybe all of it. When the door closed behind him, the house fell into a silence, so vast I could hear my own breathing. The weight that had lived in my chest for years loosened, then lifted entirely, leaving behind something unfamiliar.
Space.
Freedom. But the moment didn't feel like triumph. Not yet. It felt like the breath after a scream, the aftermath of something powerful and life-altering, the kind of moment that changes you in ways you don't fully understand until much later. I stood alone in the dim light of the living room, the evidence of his destruction still glowing across the TV screen. My hands trembled for the first time that night, not from fear, but from everything that came after fear. Because the truth was, exposing him wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of everything that followed. And I had no idea just how much more my life was about to change. After the door closed behind Mark, the silence in the house felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just unfamiliar. It was as if the air itself didn't know how to exist without the constant pressure of his presence. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet, letting it settle into the spaces he had filled with fear, manipulation, and secrets. It felt almost wrong to breathe normally again, like my body had to relearn what it meant to feel safe. My mom came home an hour later. I watched the realization spread across her face as she saw the empty living room, the open laptop, the lingering tension in the air. I didn't have to say anything at first. She could feel that something irreversible had happened. When I finally told her the truth about the fraud, the accounts, the way he had used her and targeted me, her hands went to her face, and her knees buckled. Not out of shock, but out of a grief so deep it had probably been living inside her long before I discovered his secrets. But beneath the grief, there was something else in her eyes too. Relief. Pure, unfiltered relief. The days that followed were a blur of statements, paperwork, and investigators asking questions I never thought I'd need to answer. I handed over everything I'd collected, every file, every screenshot, every timestamp. They told me the case would take time, but they also told me something I needed to hear. I had done the right thing. Still, doing the right thing didn't mean it was easy. I expected to feel triumphant, victorious, maybe even proud. I thought that exposing him would fill the empty space he'd carved out in my life with something bright, something empowering. But the truth is, revenge, in any form, doesn't offer a clean, neat ending. It leaves you with aftershocks, echoes, and questions you never expected to carry. For weeks, I felt like I was living in fragments. Part of me felt stronger than I ever had, like the part of my spirit he tried to crush was finally able to breathe again. But another part of me was weighed down by everything that had happened. Not guilt, no regret, just the knowledge that I had faced something that permanently changed the way I saw people, trust, and even myself. My mom struggled too. She kept replaying moments, conversations, subtle warnings she wished she had noticed sooner. I reminded her, gently and often, that abusers don't get caught because their victims are careless. They get caught because eventually someone chooses to stop living in fear. Over time, the house began to feel like ours again. My mom opened windows more often. I found myself humming while getting ready for work, something I hadn't done in years. Little by little, the shadow he cast faded, replaced by the quiet warmth we had forgotten how to enjoy. And yet, the impact of what happened didn't disappear. It changed me. Revenge had given me back control, but it also forced me to confront the parts of myself I had ignored for too long. The part that stayed silent even when something felt wrong. The part that let fear take root because speaking up seemed riskier than staying quiet. When I finally had space to breathe, I realized something important. Revenge wasn't the ending of my story. It was the catalyst. It pushed me to reclaim my life, to speak up, to believe in my own voice. It reminded me that justice sometimes needs someone willing to hold up the truth, even when their hands are shaking. As the case against Mark moved forward, his world unraveled exactly the way it needed to. Every lie he built had a consequence waiting for him, and for once, none of those consequences fell on me or my mom. Watching it unfold didn't bring me joy, but it did bring me peace. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't just protect yourself. You protected someone you love. You ended a cycle before it swallowed you whole. And maybe that's what revenge really is. Not destruction, but prevention. Not cruelty, but clarity. Not hatred, but the refusal to allow wrongdoings to keep growing in the dark. I still think about that night sometimes. The quiet. The fear in his eyes. The certainty in mine. I think about how easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I hadn't been willing to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it was. But most of all, I think about the moment after he was gone, the moment I realized that the power he tried to take from me was never his to keep. Life has a way of teaching us who we are through the people who try to break us. And sometimes, the strongest part of your story begins at the very moment someone else tries to write your ending for you. My revenge didn't just expose his secret. It exposed my strength. And if you've ever been pushed into silence, made to doubt yourself, or trapped in someone else's darkness, maybe my story is a reminder that you don't have to stay there. You're allowed to fight back. You're allowed to reclaim your story. You're allowed to choose yourself, even when it terrifies you. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive on its own. Sometimes you have to be the one who opens the door. And now I want to ask you something, the same question that's stayed with me long after the dust settled. When someone tries to destroy your life, how far would you go to take it back?